Hello everyone, and welcome to Mr. Simplify's tutorials. In this tutorial, we're going to look into a psychological assessment tool, the MMPI. What is the MMPI? MMPI stands for Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory and is one of the most frequently used psychological assessment tools used by therapists to assess personality traits and to also diagnose mental health conditions. The test essentially involves completing a number of questions in a questionnaire. There are different types of MMPI questionnaires, and the number of questions depends on the type of the MMPI questionnaire taken. We'll look at these different types in this tutorial as well. The MMPI consists of two types of scales, essentially: the clinical scale and validity scales. So there are a number of clinical scales and a number of validity scales. We'll be looking into what these scales are and how they actually work in this tutorial. There will also be a discussion point at the end of the tutorial, and it will be useful for everyone if responses are provided to these discussion points, because it will really help enrich your knowledge in terms of the MMPI and how it's used. I would also highly appreciate if you like this tutorial and use the comment section to recommend future topics that you're interested in for this channel to cover. And also, if you give me a hello or a hi in this in the comment section, I will certainly respond back to you as well, because I do love responding to your questions. Now, it is important to note before we proceed that mental health professionals don't rely on the MMPI alone to provide a full mental health diagnosis. It's normally one of the many tools used to diagnose mental health illnesses. There are a number of proactive MMPI tests available for people to take on the internet. I have provided a link to one such online test, but I can't really vouch for its accuracy, by the way, or its validity. There are a number of MMPI tests that you can take and find on the internet. The real MMPI test is only designed to be administered by clinical practicing professionals. It is also sometimes used by organizations to assess candidates in certain high-risk professions. It is, however, not built for these purposes. It is essentially one of the most important tools used by clinical professionals for psychological assessment. That is the purpose of the MMPI, and that's why it was designed. Now let's look into MMPI variants or types. And before that, we need to understand that the original MMPI test was developed by clinical psychologist Stark Hathaway and neurophysicist J.C. McKinley, who were actually faculty members at the University of Minnesota, and hence the name. But over the years, a number of shortcomings were observed with the test. These were reduced over time, and a number of variants were released to make the test more accurate and actually reduce a number of different types of biases observed in the original test. After revisions, the test was named MMPI-2 and then later revised again to become MMPI-3, which is actually the latest version as of recording this tutorial. We also have the MMPI-2RF, which stands for MMPI Restructured, which is a shortened version of the MMPI-2. We also have the MMPI-A and again the MMPI-A-RF. So again, restructured, which are actually standard and restructured versions designed for adolescents between the ages of 14 to 18 years. So there is a different set of MMPI questionnaires for adolescents aged between 14 and 18. But whatever be the version, the basic concept of scales remains the same. So the structure on which the MMPI tests are based on remains the same. So let's start looking into the actual scales now. We will be looking at the scales for the standard version here. The RF versions use slightly different types of scales. Right, so the first types of scales are the clinical scales. There are 10 different clinical scales in the MMPI. A person rating high on each scale indicates a different type of mental condition. There are, however, overlaps between the scales, so the scales are not actually absolute. Basically, a number of questions relate to each scale, and these provide an assessment of how one ranks on each individual scale. You will understand the meaning of this once you look into the actual types of scales. So let's look at the actual types of scales. Scale 1 is called hypochondriasis. This scale determines if one worries way too much about one's health conditions. So it has a number of questions which actually tries to determine if a person worries way too much about one's own health conditions. A high score on this scale could indicate that you worry so much about your own health that it actually interferes with your life and your relationships. Scale 2 is depression. This scale measures a person's complete dissatisfaction with their own life. Depression here is accompanied by poor morale and a very low hope for the future. In extreme cases, there could also be suicidal thoughts in individuals who rate high on this scale. Scale 3 is hysteria. Now, this scale is a measure of physical symptoms and emotional responses of individuals in stressful situations. An interesting thing to note here in this scale is that hysteria was actually incorrectly considered to be an exclusively female disorder in the past, but then came Freud, who actually disproved this being a female-specific disorder and opened it up to be something that both males and females can experience. The next type of scale is the psychopathic deviate scale. Now, as opposed to what the name suggests, this scale is actually a measure of a personality disorder rather than a psychotic tendency. A high score on this scale could be considered to be a measure of antisocial behavior and lack of morals. Now, scale 5 measures masculinity or femininity. Now, this scale was originally designed with homosexuality being considered as a mental disorder. Unfortunately, it was therefore originally intended to seek out homosexual tendencies, to sniff it out. Thankfully, it is now used as a measure of the extent to which a person accepts gender stereotypes, how he or she accepts the system that we live in and accepts the role of different genders. Scale 6 measures paranoia. This is an important scale, very important scale, used to evaluate certain psychotic symptoms in individuals. Symptoms diagnosed here include extreme suspicion of other people, extreme sensitivity, very rigid black and white thinking in people, amongst other things. High scores on this scale could actually indicate a certain level of psychosis. The next scale is psychasthenia. Now, psychasthenia is no longer used as a diagnosis. This scale was designed to measure levels of anxiety, depression, and certain clinical OCD symptoms, which is obsessive compulsive disorders. But certain professionals still use this scale to evaluate certain types of unhealthy compulsions. Scale 8 is a measure of schizophrenia. Now, this scale was originally designed to diagnose whether you have or if you're likely to develop schizophrenia. It essentially evaluates symptoms like hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, social alienation, and lack of self-worth. The next scale measures hypomania. Now, hypomania is generally found in people with bipolar disorders and actually causes unusually high levels of physical and mental energies in such people. This scale was actually designed to measure symptoms of hypomania like rapid thoughts and speech and hallucinations and brief periods of extreme depression. The next scale, which is scale 10, measures social introversion. Now, this scale was developed later than the other 9 scales and is actually a measure of whether a person seeks out or withdraws from social interactions. This is therefore a measure of introversion versus extroversion. So these are the 10 scales used in a standard MMPI, and there are a number of questions relating to each scale. So depending on how you actually answer these questions, you will be rated in each scale by the clinical practitioner, and you will be provided a rating on each scale, and then that's how you come to an assessment on each type of scale. Now, there are also validity scales, which we've discussed. Now, let's look at what validity scales are. Now, validity scales were actually designed keeping in mind that people might not be honest when they answer these questionnaires. There could be several reasons for this, like people taking employment screenings or court proceedings. It essentially evaluates the extent of people's honesty in their answers. Now, there are 3 types of validity scales with similar purposes, so let's look at them now. In the first type of validity scale, there are 3 types of scales which try to identify if people are being non-responsive or inconsistent in their responses. CNS scale, which means cannot say scale, the VRIN scale, which is the variable response inconsistency, and the TRIN scale, which means the true response inconsistency scale. The CNS measures the number of cannot say responses, and the VRIN measures people responding without properly reading questions, and TRIN measures fixed response patterns, which is again a measure of people not reading questions. So you can see that a number of questions are trying to assess the validity or the truthfulness or the honesty of the answers provided by individuals. So that was the first type of validity scale. Now, the second type of validity scale tries to identify if people are exaggerating their responses to appear worse than how they actually feel. Here we have the F scale, the FB scale, and the FP, P for Peter, scale, and the FBS scale. These are similar to one another and are all designed to identify over-reporting of symptoms. So people might possibly do this to avail treatment faster by appearing worse off than they actually are, or also due to genuine conditions wherein they actually feel they're getting worse with time and need to actually exaggerate their symptoms to the same extent. The third type of validity scale tries to identify people underreporting their symptoms to try and make their psychological health seem much better than it actually is. And here the scales are the L scale, the K scale, and the S scale. So there you see the 3 types of validity scales are essentially looking at people not responding or not reading questions right, the people who are trying to exaggerate their responses for one reason or the other, and people who are actually underreporting their symptoms for one reason or the other. So these are actually trying to understand if the responses provided are valid responses, and then the ratings provided in the actual clinical scales are adjusted accordingly. Now, how about the validity of the MMPI tool itself? There have always been questions regarding the validity of the MMPI since it was first designed. As discussed, a number of updates and revisions were made to the tool to reduce various biases and inaccuracies. It is, however, not still a fully comprehensive tool for psychological assessment and will probably never be. It will always be a tool one of the tools used with many others to provide a medical diagnosis of psychological disorders. Now, we come to our discussion point. What is your experience with psychological assessment tools like the MMPI? Do you think you've ever taken the MMPI or any other test on the advice of a clinical professional? Have you ever come across the MMPI in any recruitment process or any legal proceedings? And also, are there other psychological assessment tools that you wish to learn more about? Let me know in the comment section, and I'm sure that it will help the community here understand and learn from your experience as well. Great! Thank you very much for your attendance to this tutorial as always. And as always, please like, please share, please subscribe, and again, please do keep taking care of yourself, and this includes your physical health and your mental health. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.